The OfficeWriter Azure Web Samples were developed as an adaptation of the OfficeWriter v4 web samples, made to run on the Windows Azure cloud platform and specifically on a web role cloud resource in Windows Azure's Platform as a Service offering. The infrastructure as a service offering on Windows Azure, the so-called persistent virtual machines, would be a much simpler environment in which to deploy this code. But getting the code to run on a web role makes for a higher value proposition because the maintenance around web roles for the developer is much lower. With the correct credentials, the code can be downloaded from this GitHub repository. This repository contains all the source code for a full Visual Studio solution. The source code was actually written for Visual Studio 2010 and was tested using versions of Word and Excel 2010. However, what we'll be showing in this video is the same code running inside of Visual Studio 2012. The Visual Studio solution consists of two projects. The second one listed here, OfficeWriter Web Samples, is in effect the same project containing all the source code for the OfficeWriter v4 samples. There are a few important differences, however, and we'll go over those in this video. First of all, this project contains a new folder called Hadoop, which contains big data demos that will be covered in a separate video. In addition to that, however, you'll see an OfficeWriter license key reg file and a reg.ow command file that can be used to apply the reg file. This is important since we don't have physical access to the virtual machine on which the code will run. We will need to script the installation of the OfficeWriter license key in order for the code to run properly. The other project in the solution is a Windows Azure web role project. We can show you exactly where that exists in the Visual Studio menu by pretending to add a new project. And if we click on Cloud, you'll see there's a Windows Azure Cloud Service project. If we clicked on OK, we would then be asked for what type of cloud service project, and the first one, the default selection, ASP.NET Web Role, is exactly the project type that was added here. This is not a project that contains source code per se. It contains mostly configuration information, including Azure subscription identifiers, Azure storage, account identifiers, and particular modules that need to be used in both the local development environment and the deployed cloud environment. In addition, this service definition.csdef file contains, among other things, a notation that our command file back in our source code project should be run upon startup of the virtual machine to which this code will be deployed. So again, this task item in the startup section of the service definition for the cloud service invokes the running of this Windows command file, which in turn applies to the registry the keys in this reg file. That is what will end up installing the OfficeWriter license key so that all of the code that uses OfficeWriter will run without error. Notice, however, that none of this will work unless the copy to output directory property, shown right here in the properties grid, is set to copy always for both the reg file and the CMD file. If the properties are not set in that way, then those files will not actually deploy along with the source code. And even though the startup task is set to run that command file, the command file won't in fact be present and therefore won't be able to execute. So the steps are to include the startup task in the startup section of the service definition.csdef file, then to have the command file that runs regedit and applies the license key reg file, and then have the reg key file itself, and both the command file and the reg file must have their copy to output directory set to copy always. Once the source code is properly assembled, it can be published by right-clicking on the project node for the web role project, not the source code project, and choosing Publish. See the next video in this series for details on how the runtime environment for the Windows Azure version of the OfficeWriter web samples is similar to and differs from the standard on-premises ASP.NET deployment scenario.